What a spectacle. What a game. Who could be disappointed unless you root for Texas? I get it, of course. But other than that, hey, if you're just kicking back watching college football, it gets really no better than that in terms of what we saw on Saturday when you throw in the tradition, the brands, the spectacle, the final game in the Big 12 in this rivalry, and then, of course, just the sheer action and drama on the field. Oklahoma upsets Texas 34-30. Jason Ray's here, of course, for Oklahoma Sooners Live. We appreciate Jason, who provided the post-game show, so check that out if you have yet to do so. And Sooner Tailgate every Friday. Hey, Jason, how are you?
Doing good, Mark. Yeah, as you mentioned, I think for Oklahoma fans specifically, obviously it was a great game. But I think just nationally, as you look at it, if you don't have a rooting interest in either side, I mean, most of these games, particularly over the last 10 to 12 years, last year aside, have been really competitive over the last few years. Specifically the last couple of years, if you want to look at it that way. But yeah, fantastic game. I think fantastic way to, I think, exit the Big 12 as far as this game goes.
And I don't know if I phrased it this way to you when we did our show last week, but we had John Hoover on this week and did a segment with him. And it just kind of hit me that in any other year, under any other circumstance, the Big 12 would have been like pushing this game out there, like, look at us, see us, look how great our two brands are undefeated and maybe both headed to the college football playoff, and look at how awesome we are and look at this spectacle. But it was this contradiction of,
Yeah.
well, they're leaving, so we don't even want to. Brett Yormark didn't even show up at the game. Greg Sankey was at the game.
Yeah.
That probably came across your plate. And not only was Greg Sankey there, you were there.
Yeah, no, I think, like I said, it was. You're right as far as that goes, and I think we talked about this last week with me and you, but specifically, I think there's a lot of, and I think the same can be said for Texas, but there's a lot of fans, even when you see like Big 12, like the official Big 12 account, like trying to push this, neither side has any interest in it. It's interesting. I think there is a general level of frustration. I think with the Big 12, I think it was there in the beginning of the year, coming into this year, knowing, hey, Oklahoma and Texas are ready to go to a conference that is certainly better than what the conference is as it is today. But I think even more so with some of the comments that Yormark made early on in the season, basically rooting for Texas Tech to beat Texas, and just some of the shade that he'd thrown towards both schools. I think it's one of those things that I think OU and Texas fans alike were certainly happy that Sankey was there versus Yormark being there. So I think there's the feeling is, I would say, certainly mutual on both sides. I think Big 12 certainly seems like they're ready to move on into what their future looks like without Oklahoma and Texas, and obviously Oklahoma and Texas are the same way. But yeah, I mean, it was incredible environment, with everything going on. The first time both of these teams coming into the game undefeated since 2011. The Big 12 aside, I think there was and going into this game, Mark, I felt this through the week, and then certainly felt it on Saturday, that this was Oklahoma. This was a fan base that was really starving for something really good to happen on the field, right? There's been pockets last year of good play and some, positive situations, but, there's only so much that can happen from a 6-7 team when you're used to winning conference championships, playing for national championships, playing in playoff games. And so I think the last really good, big time moment on the field was this game in 2021 when, the Caleb Williams comeback game there that he spearheaded that. And so having this being kind of a full circle moment, just from an end, not even getting into the game itself, but the anticipation and really just being ready for something really, really good to happen was very interesting for me to see and notice. And that talk was like that throughout the week. And I think it ended up being that way coming into the game as well.
Jason, before we grind it down to the football on the field and we stay big picture, yes, this game is enormous each year because of the rivalry and the brands. But looking at how it impacts the national landscape, Oklahoma has owned this conference since Texas went to the BCS championship game in 2009. And so there have been really good games, but usually it's, well, Texas is 2-2, or they might be off to a decent start, but then soon after, you mentioned the Caleb Williams game, Texas went off the rails and lost like 5 straight, in the fourth quarter.
Yep.
And, Oklahoma has been the college football playoff participant and the Big 12 just owner of the conference. And so it hasn't, and we have yet to see. So it's unfair to completely judge this game and how big it is, because we got to see how the rest of the season plays out. And we have the advantage with all the other games to say in previous season, well, it played out this way. So in the moment, it seemed like an enormous game, and then things changed and it didn't turn out to be, or it turned out to be very impactful in terms of the championship race. We were talking before we started to record that, with no disrespect to anyone, including West Virginia, let's face it, unless things change drastically, these two teams are playing at a different level than everybody else. And so we all expect them to have a rematch in the championship game. But all that being said about what we don't know and how this is going to impact the Big 12 race and the national championship or the playoff race, this is the biggest win for Oklahoma since, how would you fill in the blank?
So it's interesting that you mentioned that. We were having a discussion about that on, I think it was Monday, with a group of guys that I talked to, and I think the one came to mind was, I think it was 2017 against Ohio State. That's the one and I may have my years wrong. But
that's right.
But that's the one that comes to mind. I think in the same vein, in a lot of different ways, right? So that was that game in 2017. I think Ohio State came into that game. I think they were number 2 or number 3, and Oklahoma was like 5 or 6, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so it was really a measuring stick game, I think, for the program in terms of, can they compete with the elite, specifically being on the road in a very tough environment. And Ohio State, the previous year, Ohio State handled Oklahoma and Norman. I mean, not in a blowout fashion, but I think it ended up being like a 17 to 21 point game and controlled the game for the most part. So I think there's a lot of parallels between that game. Certainly in this game, obviously the neutral side is a little bit different than actually going to Columbus and winning that game. But that's the one that seems to be very consistent in terms of, because this was another measuring stick game for Oklahoma, right? Coming off of last year, specifically this particular game last year, in which Oklahoma was not competitive at all. And so this was a measuring stick, again, to see where this team and this program is from a year ago to today.
Now let's get to the game itself. And I have to admit, and I made it pretty obvious on here, that I expected a good game. I expected Texas to win because I just didn't see where Oklahoma was better than Texas. I looked at every position, just kind of reviewed and thought, even where Oklahoma could be argued to be better at a particular position, it wasn't by much. And it just seemed as though Texas just had too much. And obviously they were battle tested against one extremely good team, and then also the Kansas game, and they just decimated Kansas. So they just looked like the better team. They looked, and I think I made this comment to you, they looked coming in, and to a large degree still do, like a top 3 to 5 team in the country, and Oklahoma looked more like they're a top 20 team. And so I thought it would be a good game, but Texas would wear on them and just prove to have the better athletes on the outside in particular. What I was impressed with, and maybe we can start the conversation here, was the Oklahoma defense. I think during the latter portion of Bob Stoops' tenure, and then certainly through Lincoln Riley, this Oklahoma defense has gained a reputation of being passive and a bit soft and all those things. From the first play of the game, I think Woody Washington threw somebody down on a screen pass for like a 3-yard loss. Yep. And then the very next play, or maybe the play after, was the pick where the DB jumped the route. I just thought, this is really aggressive. These players, not talking about the scheme being aggressive, just the players being aggressive. That second pick down near the goal line was Billy Bowman just, boom, laying a tag on that receiver, popping the ball up in the air. They just came out on fire.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Mark. And I get a little goosebumps, like just talking about this, right, from an Oklahoma perspective, just because, it's been such a long struggle. And, I think I mentioned this to you guys last week that I don't really believe in jinxes or anything, but I'd mentioned last year after the Nebraska game that, Venables was able to fix what had been broken in just a few games. Well, we know how the end of the season went. I think it's through 6 games. I think at this point, I think it's fair for us to say specifically who they played this past week, in saying that the defense is remarkably more improved. So one of the things that I thought was a key to the game for Oklahoma was being able to get off to a fast start, maybe get a lead early on, but I think one thing that kind of presented itself throughout the game, that Oklahoma was the tougher team, as you'd mentioned, that getting pushed around from time to time, and some of just a lot of aggressiveness. I mean, you even mentioned Ethan Downs probably played his best game that he's ever played in an Oklahoma uniform, had a couple of sacks, and a couple of times, like, he sacked Ewers, and he bends over and he's just, he's talking trash to him. And so I think it's just a level of toughness that Brent Venables and the entire defensive staff has been able to bring to this program. So yeah, I think setting the tone early on, you're exactly right. Woody Washington blew up JT Sanders on that swing pass for a couple of yards lost, and the very next play, Gentry Williams steps in there for an interception. So there's different spots, I think, Mark, that you can point to throughout the game that Oklahoma's defense, I think if you poll Oklahoma fans what was their favorite moment of the game, it's not necessarily the game-winning touchdown pass to Nick Anderson. I think it's the goal line stand, right? It's the goal line stand, and I understand that Oklahoma probably got away with a little bit of a face mask on Worthy in that final play. Be that as it may, it was still an outstanding goal line stand, and that's something that you haven't really seen out of Oklahoma. I think that's the epitome, Mark, of the culture change that you've been able to see with this team. Previous years, you got a team that gets the ball to the 1 yard line with 3 or 4 downs to go. I think there's a little bit of just I wouldn't necessarily giving up, but just tipping your hat to the other teams, like, okay, they scored, let's go back and let's outscore them now. And that certainly wasn't the case. So yeah, I think the defense, when you look at it, and it's just modern day college football, right? 2023, even really, really good defenses, they're going to give up yards and points, right? Like Alabama gave up, I don't remember what the yardage was, but 34 points to this Texas team. You're going to give up points specifically to this team, because I want to make sure, and I know you mentioned this as well, but for me, this is the best Texas team that I've seen. Oh gosh, Mark, maybe since the 2008 team, right? That Colt McCoy team that beat Oklahoma in Red River in that year. They're really good at every level, really good. Offensive line, Quinn Ewers is a really solid quarterback. Like he nails after that first start, the first bit of the first quarter, and so nothing gets taken away from Texas. They're just as good as I thought they were. But I think you're exactly right. The defense and how they played, how aggressive they were, the attacking mentality is very, very refreshing. And I think not a complete surprise, but I think an unknown, right, coming into this game. This was a really good defensive team early on through 5 games, but everyone knew coming into this game it was a completely different animal playing this Texas team. And I think the area, Mark, that I was maybe a little bit more concerned with for Oklahoma was Oklahoma's secondary against Texas's receivers. You've got 3 NFL guys in that wide receiver room when you include Jatavian Sanders at the tight end position with Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell. And then Jordan Whittington is a really solid guy as well. So I think you look at that, and I think there were some injuries on both sides, right? I think that's what some of the Texas contingency is mentioning. Yeah, we had a couple of injuries. Well, Oklahoma was down. Key Lawrence, their one of their safeties, ended up playing corner in the fourth quarter because Gentry Williams was out with a dehydration issue. One of their backup cornerbacks was out of the game, so that's who they felt the most comfortable with right there. So yeah, I think defensively it was just very, very, I think, exciting, rewarding for most people to look at and see exactly how they were able to play against a team like this.
Dillon Gabriel. So what I do is, this is like my, college football. Like I got notepads all over the place. I'm taking notes. So what I do is at noon, I have figured out that I can only lock in on 2 games at the same time. I don't have the mental capacity to watch like 5 games and really understand what's going on. And even 2 is sometimes a challenge, but Oklahoma, Texas, whatever the other game was. And I'm taking notes. And I'm seeing where Dillon Gabriel is playing well, but for example, the blocked punt that Texas had was preceded by a 3rd and 13 where Dillon Gabriel had a post route with either Stoops or Farouk, and they were wide open. They just blew by their guy and had a good 3 or 4 steps, and he just airmailed it. And there were a few passes like that. Okay, but besides that, this guy, he pulled through as well, of course, both as a runner and a passer. And some of those receivers in that entire receiver room that's been somewhat maligned about being average certainly proved their worth as well.
Yeah, Mark. I mean, I mentioned I talked a lot about this in our post game, but the narrative around Dillon Gabriel, not specifically from just generally speaking, but I've mentioned this a few times, is like he's not in the mold of a Jalen Hurts or a Kyler Murray or a Baker Mayfield or a Caleb Williams, or insert your quarterback name here from Oklahoma in the past, where he's not a guy that's going to be able to take the team on his shoulders and win the game. Well, he did that on Saturday. 398 total yards in this game from scrimmage, the 3rd most ever in this rivalry. I think Jalen Hurts and Kyler Murray were the 2, or maybe it was Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield were the other 2. And so, yeah, I think he would be the first to admit it wasn't a perfect game. To your point about overthrowing a couple, and there was a couple of erratic throws from time to time. I think he was 23 out of 38 overall. So not where he'd been previously, but I think at the same time you take into account how good this Texas defensive line is, and he had I don't believe there was any sacks in the game, but he was under pressure quite a bit. So, Mark, I think specifically, whether you want to just explicitly talk about the last drive or some of the toughness plays that he made, whether it was quarterback by design, type of situations, or just scrambling and getting himself open, or getting himself some movement to buy some time for his receivers. But best game that I think he's ever played at Oklahoma, specifically with everything on the line. The biggest game that he's ever played, and he played really, really well in the game overall. And his legs were in some aspects, Mark, you could say, his legs were the difference. He ran them for over 100 yards in the game, the leading rusher for Oklahoma. So yeah, just really, really proud of him and what he was able to do, and just all the flawless execution that they had on the game-winning drive too.
Well, of course, the focus needs to be on Oklahoma, and we'll take your comments and questions here at the Voice of College Football. Consider contributing here, whether that's Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App at Mark Rogers TV, or with a super chat right here as well. I'll divert this to Texas for a brief moment. And this came to mind thinking about a few Dylan Gabriel misses. One was to Austin Stogner. It was about 3rd and 5. They could have hung on to the ball. They must have had the lead. Mm-hmm. And there's about 3 or 4 minutes left. And it was actually a good pass. He just fired it 100 miles an hour, and Stogner didn't turn around in time and kind of missed it. And then Texas gets the ball. And it looked like they had the game in control, because I'm forgetting. So so it was 27-all. Must have been 27-all, because then Texas took the lead with a field goal. But it just didn't seem like Sark, for as good as he is in terms of handling an offense, they seem to get way too conservative. And they also seem to treat the time on the clock like there was 30 or 40 seconds left in the game or something. Like, they were starting to they stalled that offense and shut it down with like way too much time, and just pretty much conceded that they were going to kick a field goal. And even in the moment, I thought, why are they not scoring the game-winning touchdown?
Yeah.
and they're just treating it like there's less time than there is. They're going to give this ball to Oklahoma with way too much time, and that's what happened.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. It was it was a little bit surprising. I think very specifically the most surprising aspect of that final drive for Texas was that they elected to run the ball on 3rd and long, as opposed to actually trying to, because they were pretty much, Oklahoma was worn out a bit in the 4th quarter. You could tell they were fatigued, and so they were overall in the 4th quarter, they were doing about whatever they wanted for the most part. Oklahoma would stiffen up on a few plays and things like that, but they were moving the ball with fair regularity in the 4th quarter. So the fact that they did not put the ball in the air on that 3rd down was very surprising to me. And yeah, I agree. The clock management was certainly a bit of an issue there that I've seen a lot of discussions about. And yeah, I agree. You would like to have, even if you still go the field goal route, you would have liked to, if you're Texas, to to run that clock down a little bit. And so I think when you take the Oklahoma spin, I think, versus this, Mark, is the fact that a very solid argument could be made that Brent Venables very much outcoached Sark in this game. Like, specifically, one of the things that Brent struggled with last year, self-admittedly, is clock management, in-game clock management. And he, if you remember, at the end of the first half, they had all 3 timeouts left, and they saved those for Texas's final drive. Oklahoma ends up getting the ball back, goes down the field. Should have scored a touchdown. That was the one where Tawi Walker dropped the ball right there at the end zone, but they got a field goal in that. And then kind of the same thing in that last drive. Oklahoma had 1 timeout to use, and then when Texas ran the ball, it allowed Oklahoma to get the ball back with, I think, a minute 15, a minute 20, somewhere in that neighborhood. So yeah, I think that was and what was weird was Sark after the game and I don't even know if it's specifically just after, but his press conference on Monday, he said if he had to do it over, he would do it over exactly the same way. And so I don't know. I mean, it's, I think it's a rivalry. This is the part, and I kind of I put my coaching hat on when I look at this. I think the thing that's really drawing the ire of a lot of Oklahoma fans right now is the fact that there was from Sark at all, there was no credit whatsoever given to Oklahoma in this game. It was the fact that, well, we didn't play well in this game, or, the turnovers, or talked about the number of yards that Texas had. There was no credit given to, hey, they were the better team on the field. They beat us today. And so, maybe he felt like that was what his team needed to hear from a psychological perspective. But I thought that was a little strange because Brent on the other side was just extremely complimentary of almost going above and beyond, during game week and even after, talking about how good this team was. So just interesting perspectives, I think, on both coaches with how this game looked. And right, I understand that there's a lot of people watching this game that think, well, if Oklahoma doesn't have the goal line stand and they don't force the turnovers, it's a different game. And which, I mean, that's a fair, that's fair, but at the same time, I think you can make the argument Oklahoma forced these things to happen. It wasn't just bad luck situations by Texas, but I think on the same token, on the flip side, you don't have the block punt, you don't have the missed field goal from Oklahoma. I think there was a situation where they were down around the goal line and they had like a horrible punt, gave Texas excellent field position. So, these things go both ways, and the game will be different in December in Arlington in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I think the clock management side of it and just the coaching aspect I think that was another real, I don't know if I would say pleasant surprise, but Brent Venables' in-game coaching in this game was much, much better than it had been last year.
Absolutely. Texas got that final drive with 4:42 left at their own 13, and they moved it rather well, got inside the Oklahoma 30, 40-yard line, and then, they just shut it down. And they kicked that field goal, and Oklahoma still has a minute 17 after the kickoff. So Oklahoma still has plenty of time, and they're only down by a field goal. They're not down by 4 and having to score a touchdown, but of course they did.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it was an interesting turn of events right there. If you remember, that was on the heels of the long run for Dillon Gabriel and Oklahoma's possession there. They have I think it was a 4th and 6, if I remember, and then Oklahoma elects to kick the field goal. In that situation, it was kind of a flip of the coin for me in terms of what's your decision? Do you go for it or do you kick the field goal? And I still think kicking the field goal is the right football decision, because if you make that field goal, the game's essentially over at that point, right? You go up by 2 scores with 4 minutes and some change to go, and then so a couple of interesting decisions by both coaches right there kind of led to how that game ended for sure.
Our buddy Jackson is here. We appreciate Jackson moving from channel to channel, and he gives us great support across the network. And he would like to know, Jason, your player of the game.
Oh goodness, that's that's a tough one too. I probably would say, I mean, you could go a couple of different ways. I mean, I'm going to choose to go on the defensive route. You could go with Ethan Downs for his 2 sacks. I'm just going to go Gentry Williams. I think he set the tone, like I said, early on, and he was also involved in that fumble recovery where Quinn Ewers fumbled on the big hit from I think Peyton Bowen was the guy that delivered the big hit on that one. But yeah, I mean, you could go with a lot of different. I'll just go with Gentry Williams in this one, just from a tone setting perspective.
We talked a lot about the running backs last week, and that's typically turns out to be my favorite discussion, especially during these games that aren't that consequential. Now, this game, we can go in all sorts of directions, and we already have. But Tyree Walker got the 15 carries, Marcus Major with 9, and Gavin Sawchuk had 1. So is that about what you expected?
Yeah, I think they. So what they did, Mark. I think Marcus Major was the starter. He got a bulk of the carries early on in this game, but I think they needed a little bit more tough running in between the tackles from time to time. And I think what separated itself, at least in my mind, that right now until Javonte Barnes gets ready, and basically like he's got like a turf toe type situation going on, which he's still struggling with, and then Gavin Sawchuk's still trying to get back into game shape. I think right now Tawee Walker's your best running back for Oklahoma. He ran really hard, did a lot of good things in the passing game as well, just in terms of pass protection. Obviously, dropped that touchdown towards the goal line. But yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what you're going to see is those two get the bulk of the carries right now for the remainder of the season. And I think, Mark, you have a lot from, and I heard somebody say this after the game, which is really interesting. I didn't even really think of this when they talked about players of the game. Somebody said Jackson Arnold, because without Jackson Arnold, Oklahoma's not in a position where they're willing to run Dylan Gabriel as much as they did in this game, without fear of hey, if he gets hurt, like what kind of trouble were we in? So Oklahoma ran for over 200 yards in this game. I thought honestly, like if they ran for 100, then they had a chance to win the game. And so I never thought that Oklahoma would be able to run for 200 in this game, no matter what the situation was. If it was QB run, running backs, you got some of the wide receivers in space on some jet sweeps and stuff like that. So I think that's a positive that you take moving forward. I think for Oklahoma, knowing the fact that you're not going to play until Arlington, presumably against Texas, you're not going to play a defense that's even remotely as talented as what Texas is the remainder of the season.
Yes. I don't know that they're going to play a good defense outside of West Virginia. West Virginia is mounting a pretty good defensive effort. They've been a pleasant surprise in the Big 12, but man, they are gutting out games. So that's their MO right now in terms of strong running game. Don't want to throw it more than 20 times, and defense. And so they will present a challenge, but from a talent standpoint, yes, nowhere close. But they've put together good defense, so that will be an interesting affair. And of course, UCF is the next game on the schedule at home on October 21st after the bye week. Talking Sooners with all of you each and every Wednesday is our typical time with Jason. That's every Wednesday, 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 where it counts. And however, at times we need to change up the schedule. Therefore, we would ask that you would subscribe, and please subscribe to our Big 12 channel and lock in there, and then hit the bell for the notifications to know when we go live. And Jason brings together a Sooner tailgate show on Fridays and the post game after the games for OU. Yeah. So let's see. Where do we go next on this one? Is the block punt? I would think any kind of mistake should be diagnosed by the coaching staff and addressed. But considering they were kicking from, I think, the 2, you've got the short snap distance that pretty much led to that. So I don't want to call that a non-concern. Like the coaches shouldn't address that. What do we do better under those circumstances? But it wasn't like a normal punt block in the middle of the field where the punter had the same amount of distance as he typically does. I don't know if Brent Venables had anything to say about that breakdown.
Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot specifically around that, Mark. I think right now, I think the protection in and of itself and having the punt blocked, to your point, isn't a great concern. I think what the concern is, I think just generally speaking, is the punting game and the place kicking game is just not where it should be. It's just not. It's just not great. Like we've talked about this in the past couple of weeks, just where Oklahoma is at from a punter perspective when you look at what they have this year versus what they've had the previous couple of years with Turk back there, and then you even look at the place kicking game. So I think, Mark, at some point, and I hope this doesn't end up being. Hope that this was the situation on Saturday was the biggest issues I think that Oklahoma will have. Just in terms of costing Oklahoma a game or getting them in a position to lose the game. I think the one thing is that field goal that was missed by Schmidt there in the last moments there are some of the with 4 minutes to go there in the fourth quarter was I think the fact that he didn't even get it there. Like it didn't have enough, and it was like from I think the kick was from 45 or 46 yards. So I get it; it's a pressure kick, but so I think the concern here, I think for me, just moving forward, is if you need a big clutch kick or you need a big time punt in a game to help win the game for you, it doesn't look like that's going to come this year based on what we've seen so far. So I think Oklahoma is going to have to, if it comes to that fact, be able to overcome maybe less than stellar play from the punting and kicking game.
Question/comment coming in from Mike here concerning Andrell Anthony's injury, his season-ending injury, and how that could impact the wide receiver core.
Yeah, that's a big loss, I think, for Oklahoma coming out of this game. Clearly the biggest negative coming was the loss of Andrell Anthony for the remainder of the year. Was the leading receiver coming into this game. I haven't looked at the stats. Farouk may have overtaken him after this game, but coming into this game was the leading receiver, was the deep threat in this game. So I think it challenges the depth. I think Oklahoma's in a better spot than I would have anticipated. So you get more. I think you just Brennan Thompson is a guy that can be a big factor. I think he's probably the number one guy that would have the ability to kind of do what Andrell Anthony did from a stretching of the field perspective. So we'll see how they. Luckily, I think it came at a good time where they have the opportunity in the bye week. And no disrespect to UCF, but UCF is not a good defensive team this year. Like they gave up 400 yards on the ground to Kansas on Saturday. So UCF is not a great defensive team. So they got a little bit of time to kind of get that situation situated. So I think it's sort of not necessarily one individual player. I think it's a little bit of a committee approach in terms of, you've got Jaquays Pettaway, you've got Jaden Gibson, you've got Brennan Thompson, you've got Nick Anderson, who has played really, really well this season, but he'll start to get maybe a more focused role on this. So it's not as big of a deal, I think, as you would have expected coming into the season with Oklahoma's relative wide receiver depth. But, and there's a couple of other ones through the game just to comment on that Oklahoma is dealing with. Gentry Williams was out. I think from what I understand, it was more of a dehydration issue in the fourth quarter versus anything like true injury wise. McCade Matower got hurt late in that game. Actually, had to be carted off late in the game. I think he'll probably be out for a couple, 2 or 3 weeks. His X-rays were negative, so I think it's just a sprained knee. So you saw Caden Green come in there and play really well. True freshman out of Lee Summit, Missouri, play in that game quite a bit and really held his own there. So nothing, I think nothing earth-shattering, but I think, yeah, the Andrew Anthony was disappointing in a lot of ways. I think specifically for him because he was having a really good season. So we'll see what that, what that looks like in terms of how Oklahoma is able to replace his production.
Now, certainly, if we get the Oklahoma edition that we got on Saturday for the rest of the season, they're not losing to any of these teams, and it probably won't even be close. However, we all know college football teams and how they approach each game and the ups and downs of the season and the emotions involved and all of that. And we see teams struggle every week that shouldn't struggle against particular teams. And as I look at the schedule, I see 3 games that I would be most concerned with. That would be the trip to Kansas, and that would be the West Virginia game at home, and then that would be what I think you've targeted, even going back to the offseason, the trip to Provo to take on BYU as being possible pitfalls.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and you could even add a fourth in there when you look at going to Oklahoma State, because I don't. The Big 12 was just so psychotic this year, Mark. I was in Dallas watching, fully expecting Kansas State to win this game fairly easily against Oklahoma State. And Oklahoma State was clearly the better team on the field, and I know that Kansas State was out a couple of guys in the back end of that defense. So I'm very interested to watch Oklahoma State and Kansas play this weekend, just to see what version of Oklahoma State is where we're at now. Is it the version that lost to South Alabama, lost to Iowa State, or is it the version that beat Kansas State this past Saturday? So you kind of lump that one in there. I mean, West Virginia is certainly, to your point, probably I would say the second most talented team that Oklahoma is playing left on the season. But I think having that home is obviously very helpful. But, the 3 road games are the ones I tend to think that Kansas might be the best or the toughest of the remainder of those games. Kind of depends on what the situation with Jalen Daniels is, from an injury perspective. Obviously, you've got, it didn't really impact him a ton last week against UCF, having Jason Bean there. So, yeah, I think Oklahoma's obviously going to be favored in the game, in all of these games remaining. But as you mentioned, there's going to be road environments where Oklahoma doesn't play well, or they're not in whatever happens, and they're not playing well. So something tells me, Mark, that the BYU, I don't know why, Mark, because I don't think when you look at some of these other teams, I think West Virginia is better. I think Kansas is better. But just something about that last road game of the year against BYU, that one's going to be, just tells me, feels like that one's going to be a difficult game.
And that's getting to the point in the year when a trip to Provo may not be the most pleasant in terms of weather. It could be fine, or it could be snow flurries and damp and dreary. And if that turns out to be a night game, yeah, a lot of teams have taken a slip up at BYU through the years. Now, looking at this week's Big 12 schedule that you had alluded to, let's see what we've got. I know we've got a interesting little Thursday night affair with West Virginia taking on Houston. Then it's Iowa State, Cincinnati. Doesn't really factor in Kansas, Oklahoma State, as you mentioned, as being an interesting one suddenly. And I like you, my conventional thought, my logic was telling me that Kansas State was going to take care of business rather easily. But I I can't say that I was surprised because I knew that there was a reason that Vegas made the line. I think Kansas State was only a 3 or 4 point favorite, and Oklahoma State playing at home. And I just thought it didn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me. But again, Kansas State, up till that point, was the much better team. BYU, TCU. TCU's really having a rough season. BYU's still 4-1. So they only have one conference loss, in Kansas State, Texas Tech. So mathematically, we all have seen what we've seen, and it just tells us that Oklahoma and Texas are so much better than everyone else. But if you just look at the mathematics of the situation, there are all sorts of teams that still have a shot.
Yeah.
But man, almost this entire league, you can look at any game, almost every game's a 50-50 kind of game. So it's just inconceivable to see any of these other teams being able to run the table.
Yeah, I mean, looking at these, and you can even look at the Thursday night game as well. Like all of these 5 games, like it's almost a flip of the coin, right? I think the highest, if I remember right, I think the highest point spread in any of these games are like Cincinnati's favored by 5 over Iowa State. I know that Kansas is like a 1 or 2 point favorite in that game, and TCU. You correct me if I'm wrong. I thought I remembered seeing this in that TCU game, but Chandler Morris got hurt in that game towards maybe midway through that game, so I don't know what his availability looks like there either. So, you're right. I mean, I think West Virginia is probably, as we mentioned before, they're like win-loss record thus far. They're probably in the best situation, but I think most of us thought Kansas State would be the team, that could get back to the Big 12 championship game. But man, they're just Will Howard just has an interest in throwing the ball to the other team this year a lot. And their defense, their secondary is just not very good. I mean, and it was accentuated this past week with the injuries. But that game was very bizarre. Watching that game, I don't know if you got a chance to watch a lot of it, Mark.
Yeah,
but
I did.
It was one of those games where it really didn't feel like either team really wanted to win. Right, like it almost felt like Oklahoma State was playing better of the two, but they kept doing things to keep Kansas State in the game and allow them to, even win the game. But Kansas State just wouldn't have any of it. And just in terms of, just mistake after mistake after mistake, because I just came away with both of those teams just not really being very good football teams this year.
And the West Virginia Houston line came out at 1 point, was at least the opening line. And I know conventional football fans just think, okay, Houston's completely off everyone's radar. Like they're done. They seem like they're just history. And West Virginia is the surprise team. And why wouldn't they be a substantial favorite? But again, I believe Vegas knows, and West Virginia is playing everyone close. So I would not expect that to be any different. One thing comes to mind about the game that you're mentioning about the Kansas State Oklahoma State game, and I don't know if you're much into the analytics and what they tell coaches to do these days, but there was a big uproar about Kansas State being down by, let me get this straight, Kansas State scored a touchdown to go down by 8 before the PAT. Yeah. So this is 7-8 minutes left in the game, something like that. So they score a touchdown to get within 8. They went for 2, and people threw a hissy fit all over the place on social media and otherwise that I saw. Now, I understand the initial reaction to that because that was my thought too. And then the more I thought about it, and I have not read up on what the analytics say about why the analytics recommend going for 2, but this is my thought. If you go for 1, you are guaranteeing that you have to score another touchdown and then have to score a third time to win the game. So you have just scored. Again, extra points are made 98% of the time, so that's not even totally guaranteed. But basically, Then you have to score again. Then you have to score again. And that's if the other team doesn't score. So you are either having to score 2 more times in regulation, or you are conceding we're going to overtime because we're going to score the game tying touchdown and send this into overtime. And then it's a 50-50 proposition, basically, or maybe less than that since you're on the road. As opposed to, I get what I think the analytics are telling us, that if you go for 2 and you get it, then you're only down 6 and you will win the game with the game-winning touchdown.
Yeah.
Or if you don't get it, you're still only down 8 and you can go for 2 and tie it up. And you should try to end the game on the road before you have to go to overtime.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right, Mark. I was watching that in my hotel room Friday night, and I was thinking the same thing. I was like, why are you going for 2 here? Like, this makes no sense whatsoever. And then the play-by-play guy, I think, was kind of explaining the analytics behind it a little bit, and I'm still thinking, yeah, I mean, yes, I understand it, but yeah, I'm like you. The more that you think about it, it makes sense. And I think part of it is from a coaching perspective. I think you've got to have the analytics side of it, and then have your own like feel for your team and how you execute that. Right? If you feel, I think in that situation, if you feel very comfortable in terms of you've got all the momentum, things are going your way at this point, then maybe playing for overtime isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. But if you're in a situation where I want to get out of here, I want to get out of here with a win. We need to do this, and then thinking about, yes, you have another opportunity to do it again if you score. So yeah, I didn't really have a problem with it either way. I mean, I'm an analytics guy, just generally speaking, so I kind of enjoyed that side of it, but wasn't really like you, wasn't really thinking at the time. But yeah, it certainly does make a lot of sense.
And then my only other comment, and I don't know that I've ever had this explained or if this information's out there. I don't know if the analytics are smart enough to determine the quality of the 2 teams, or if those are just set analytics based on score, situation, yardage, etc. Just the generic, this is what the scenario is, this is what it is. Or if they're advanced enough to, this is the scenario, this is the number 1 defense in the country, or this is the worst offense, and and to throw all that into the equation, I don't know that it goes that far into it. It probably doesn't. And that's where the coach has to know, okay, we're facing a horrible defense or a great defense, or our quarterback is tremendous on a 2-point play because he's one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the nation, or whatever. Where exactly what you're talking about, the coach has to take the analytics and say, okay, I understand it, and probably 9 out of 10 times it makes sense for us, but there's 1 or 2 times out of 10 it doesn't.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's just some stats out there that I wouldn't even think of that are, so I wouldn't put it past that some of the analytics to kind of being able to evaluate the team that you're playing against, what their strengths are, weaknesses are. But yeah, I tend to lean more towards your thinking, Mark, that it's probably not out there at that degree, or at least teams don't really think about it from that perspective, and they really kind of, yes, this is what the model tells me. If this situation, then go for 2 or kick the extra point. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of coaches' intuition that builds into that as well.
Folks, we do appreciate you being here each week for our Oklahoma show. And for whatever you missed, if you jumped in here late, you just wait for the video to post, which is basically immediately, so you can watch what you missed right now. Jason Ray's here after each Oklahoma game. Good for him. He gets the weekend off. He can just kick back and watch college football or do whatever he needs to do. By the way, Chandler Morris is projected to be out multiple games with a sprained MCL for TCU. All right, Jason, appreciate you doing this as always, sir. You make this show go for us, and look forward to next week's show and a weekend of football and your Sooner tailgate the next time that rolls around as well.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Mark.